is Dennis Nielsen, focusing on the 3-part series that ITV commissioned a couple of years ago, starring David Tennant in the lead role. To kick us off, we have a clip from the trailer.
Just take your time. Take us through it again.
So we're talking about one body or two? 15 or 16.
I mean, this whole thing is about your relief to get out of Maginnis. It's always been to Nelson's scripts. You planned this.
We have now charged a man by the name of Dennis Nilsson with murder.
Confirmed that Dennis Andrew Nielsen has been charged with the first of what is said to be multiple murders.
Someone who knows our world, our community, needs to write this.
Do you think you'll shake his hand?
No, I shouldn't think so.
But you're also fascinated by him, aren't you?
I look in the mirror, you see me. Friendly, helpful, responsible me.
Killed on our patch for 4 years. He gets away with nothing.
Nice to be listened to. Makes me feel human again.
And that was a clip from the trailer. You can find this on ITV Player as well. Joe, hello and welcome.
Oh yes, of course.
Days, I suppose, whenever we decided to come to our next episode, just with obviously the summer and people going on holiday, we had thought, let's go for something that was like a small 3-part series. Sometimes whenever you have a film, it's hard to get into the nitty gritty or covering everything that happens within a film in such a short space of time. To be honest, I think we probably set ourselves up not to fail here when you think about the span of Dennis's life and the horrible, horrific crimes he committed. It's a surprise they fit it all into 3 episodes on ITV. So, you can praise them for that. But before we get into the individual episodes, what was your view of the trilogy as a whole? Did you know much about Dennis before? Have you watched any of the other ITV crime dramas, like the Appropriate Adult that was about Fred and Rose West? What were your thoughts on that?
Well, the thing is, I never watched any of the other ones prior to this. I just seen that there was one on Dennis Nielsen. To be honest, I didn't know a lot about Dennis Nielsen's crimes. I just knew he was one of the most infamous, murderers in the history of the UK. But the thing that drew me to the show was the fact, David Tennant's doing this. This could be interesting, because usually, like, not the pan ITV dramas, but they always seem very similar and generic and the same, but something about it just made me go, okay, give this one a chance, give it a go, and I'm glad I did. I really, really liked the show. Like, funny you mentioned the summer holidays. I think the year this came out in 2020, so whenever I watched this, me and my girlfriend were still on holiday and we were waiting for the last episode to come out, and instead of like normal people going, we'll enjoy our holidays and then we'll go back to this grim drama when we come back, we're like, nah, we're going to bed early tonight, we're going to sit and watch Days, and we did, because we loved it that much.
I was just checking there as you were talking in terms of the director of the TV show, anything else that he's created. He was part of the group who came up with Broadchurch, which we know David Tennant has also been in. I imagine it would have, off the back of that, those two working together, that would have drawn David Tennant to this role. But I would agree with you. I think when this first came out, it was started the end of the first pandemic, or it was coming up to it anyway. Everything went into lockdown in early 2021, but it was in September of 2020. I don't think there was much on, but I remember, we played a clip from the trailer, and I actually remember watching that on UTV and thinking, David Tennant's obviously known for Doctor Who, he's known for other roles, he has played some serious roles, as I've mentioned, in the likes of Broadchurch, but it was just seeing him in a totally different light that really intrigued me. I was aware of Dennis Nielsen before. I'd listened to a couple of podcasts about him. Case File is another really good podcast for anybody listening there. It does go into quite great detail. The guy Casey, who is a presenter, has the 3-part series, all just about Dennis Nielsen. I think the episodes are roughly an hour each. They are quite a tough listen, seeing the mannerisms and how David Tennant took on that role. It was so fascinating to me. The cast themselves, there's quite a well-known, I suppose, group of UK cast. We have Daniel Mays, which I think a lot of people would know from The Line of Duty. He's been in different things. He plays the Detective Chief Inspector Peter J, who's the lead investigator on the case. Who's Jason Watkins as the biographer Bram Masters, which the book Killing for Company was sort of adapted for the 3-part series. Quite a small cast, I would say, because it really focuses on the capture, the interrogation and the trial. It doesn't really go so much into Dennis's childhood, but the group that they have together, it portrays the main players of the story quite well. I don't want to say story because obviously it was reality. Just coming back to the book itself, I know we had talked before in preparation for this to have a look at the book. Did you manage to have a read yourself? Reading through and watching the episodes, did you see that it was quite similar in terms of the writing or how it was adapted?
I had an audiobook, so I was lucky enough to be able to listen to it fairly quickly over the last few days just in preparation for this. And like I was telling you just off recording there, basically the first chapter is the first episode of the show, in that it just goes into the background. It's basically about, this is the area this incident happened, and then here's his arrest, here's all the things that he'd done, and then chapters 2 to about 4 or 5 even goes into his life, his childhood growing up, his time in the army, his time in the police force, his time in the civil service, and then it ends with the trial. I think it's the second last chapter's the trial, and then the chapter just before that sort of the interrogation. So it's sort of the bookends of the book or the show, but what they do in the show that works so well is they take all the information from the chapters in between and they sprinkle it in. So I was say watching episode 2 and I was like, oh, there's where he mentions about his upbringing, oh, there's where he mentions about this incident, that incident. It all just ties in so well. So I think as a whole it's as good as an adaptation as he can get through just a 3-episode miniseries, and the episodes themselves are only, without adverts, are about 45 minutes each. So when you break it down that way, it's about 2 hours 15 minutes in total. It's amazing that they're able to do that in such a condensed way.
And they handle the subject with such sensitivity as well with the book. Before we, I suppose, we get into each individual episode, going back to, I suppose, published works about Nilsen, there was 2. One which was Bram Master's book, wrote, I suppose, in tandem with Dennis, which was The Killing for Company. And there was also an unpublished book that Nilsen had written himself, a 400-page autobiography that was called The History of a Drowning Boy, which on numerous attempts Nilsen had tried to get published when he was alive. And spoiler alert, he's now dead, thank God. But there was a lot of people throughout time who refused to publish this book, actually published months after he died himself. A lot of the families protested both books, that they didn't want them written. Some families actually championed his autobiography to be released in terms of future scientists and future behavioural scientists and things like that actually being able to analyse a serial killer or a murderer's mind. But all in all, the book, I think itself that he had written, was almost like a woe is me autobiography, that he tried to justify an awful lot for what he had done, which you kind of see slightly through the episodes, and I think also through the book as well. He admits what he had done, wholeheartedly, but he doesn't always take blame, or he kind of tries to find other reasons as to why he did what he did, essentially. But I think we start at this point, need to get into each individual episode and bring the story to life. But on the outset, I think it's probably better to put a disclaimer in. If you're not aware of who Dennis Nilsen is and you're just first coming to him, this will probably have quite explicit, quite disturbing, quite graphic depictions of murder, sexual assault and sexually explicit material. Dennis Nilsen was a very upset and deranged man, so a lot of what we'll talk about here will be quite sensitive. So if this is not your type of episode or not something you want to listen to, please pause here. We will get started with episode 1. Joe, if you want to give us a brief introduction.
The thing about the first episode that I really appreciated was it starts with a lot of stock footage of London around the late 70s and early 80s, in that it helps paint a picture where below the surface of the glamour of London there is that deprivation that existed, people being addicted to drugs and rife homelessness. And then we don't actually start with Dennis himself, we start with the Deputy Chief Inspector Peter J, and we get an insight into his life. Basically, he's been through a divorce of sorts and he isn't being able to see his kids at the time. So then the detective goes into the police station, it's just a normal average day, and then one of his co-workers just basically off the phone goes to him, we need you over at 23 Cranley Gardens because they've found what could be human remains in a drain. So he goes over to the address. He's told by the guy who's working on the drainage system he's a collection of bones and all sorts of things there, and he's more or less told that the only place that really could have come from was the top apartment, which belonged to Dennis Nilsen. They wait for Dennis to arrive back home, and then once he arrives he's sort of hesitant to go, I don't know what's happening, I don't know what's going on. But then once he takes him in the flat, they get a whiff of basically death in his flat, and he just just lets down his guard and goes, there's bodies in the cupboard, there's body parts, this, that and the other place of the apartment. So the thing that I really liked about the start of the episode is just how procedural it all is, how matter of fact, like there's no sort of over dramatization going, oh no, there's bones here, there's that there. It's just like, no, this is just a normal routine. This is what detectives would do in these situations. It's very real and grounded in that respect. You know, even through reading, like I'm just referring back to the book Killing for Company, when you read the book, it's literally beat for beat what happens in that first chapter is how, you know, it leads to the eventual discovery of these remains, as well as Dennis coming out and saying, yes, here's the remains, the sort of, you've got me. And in the manner in which that's written in the book, it's very similar to the show in that he's very sort of calm about everything, stoic. He's like, well, that's it, I'm caught. You know, he's sort of a shrug of the shoulders. What did you think then from there on in the episode, and the episode in general?
Coming back to that point of him being very stoic, I think one of the most famous lines is, so glad to finally get this off my chest. And they've got him on an arrest and they take him into the back of the car, and it's well documented that Peter Jay's at the front and there's another detective in the back. I think it's Detective Steve McCusker, and he can turn to him and said, how many bodies are actually in there? And very calmly Dennis turns around and says, well, I think it's probably between about 15 to 16. They obviously were only thinking at the time that it was one body they had came across. This wasn't included in the episode, but articles and things written about him. There was a sort of ongoing investigation by his other neighbours for a couple of days about the pieces being flushed down. His tenants in the bottom floor, and then there was tenants in the middle floor, and Dennis Nilsson was at the top. The tenants in the middle floor had noticed it was a husband and wife that they were unable to flush the toilet for a couple of days. They had contacted a plumber and also the landlord and management a couple of times. It was just by absolute chance that the landlord didn't pick up the phone. The plumber didn't turn up one day. They hired another plumber. They didn't turn up one day. And Dennis Nilsson was well aware of this and was going into work every day wondering if he would come home and have the police at his door. And it was only when the final plumber who had turned up had noticed that, you know, this was out of the ordinary. He had then called his superior, who got a more industrial type of cleaner in. So this had been going on for a couple of days. I suppose this wasn't included in the episode as part of the lead up because I suppose, I don't want to say exciting, you know, I don't want to glamorize it in a way and say that it wouldn't have been as exciting as what was shown, but you know, the reality was that people had tried to flag this for a couple of days and nothing came through, which is the reality of, you know, calling a plumber no matter what sort of flushed in a drain. So it was interesting to read about that after the TV show. Yeah, I would agree. It doesn't glamorize what was happened. It doesn't fabricate the arrest. It doesn't dress it up. I've seen other sort of, not even crime dramas, but, you know, documentaries. Like I think there's the Nielsen tapes that is on Netflix, which is sort of like a semi-factual documentary about this. And it's very much, and I think it's run and created by an American company, but it's very much like Dennis was at home. The police called to the door. That sort of overhyping, sensationalizing narrative that, you know, those type of documentaries, you know, tend to have. Whereas in this, and I suppose, and I don't want to say a book about a vicious serial killer was well written, but I think this is probably in tandem with how Bran had written the book, and then how well the director, who I think also was involved in the writing, was it a guy called Luke Neal. Lewis Arnold had directed it, but it was Luke Neal who had written it. But this sort of speaks volumes to the writing of the book, but also the writing of the episode. So as we go through the episode, then, you know, he's taken into custody. It's very late at night. A lot of Peter Jay's team had went home for the day. There hadn't been an awful lot going on, and they were all sort of called back in. And rather than being interviewed in a holding cell or an interview room, Des and a lawyer they've appointed for him had been brought into Peter Jay's office. I suppose I don't want to say not make a big deal, because it was a big deal finding human body parts, but they hadn't tested anything yet. They didn't want to know. You know, at that point, Dennis just tells all, essentially. The first person he mentions is Stephen Sinclair. If you want to pick up on that point then, Joe.
Just on that point of the interrogation in general, what I thought was sort of really really well done. It's indicative of the show in general, is how to the point it is. And it goes back to your previous point. It didn't include all that background stuff because not that it's not important, it's just not necessary for the story he's trying to tell, which is basically about this sort of psychological relationship Des has between him, his biographer, and Peter J. But back to the point by Stephen Sinclair, so he's the first person that's revealed him, but it's the process in which he reveals it. It goes back to like the really dark humour that Dennis had himself, and the way that David Tennant portrays that. He's sort of like him in hand going, well, what was the name of that fella? Oh, I can't remember what the name of him was. And then all of a sudden, yes, Stephen Sinclair. Just the way he's so matter of fact about things, that sort of adds to the whole chilling edge to him. And I think just when we're talking about it, I think it's a good point now to even talk about David Tennant's performances, Des. So for me, I think, when you're going through we've seen a lot of these true crime dramas, and we've seen numerous people play these famous or infamous serial killers. There's the likes of the guy who played Ed Kemper in Manhunter and stuff like that. There, you're like, that's just so spot on in his casting. Here, you can say the exact same thing. Like his speech patterns and the mannerisms in which he uses throughout is sort of like stillness. When you watch actual interviews of Nielsen himself, you're like, yeah, that is it. That is completely on the money. It's as creepy as his performances. It's as creepy how spot on he is in getting to the core of him. What I really appreciated, and it doesn't come to, I think it's the second episode, is when he sort of breaks that stoicism a little bit when he finds out about his dog who was kept in the car. It breaks for a second, and then he realizes, oh, that's sad. Right, back to where I am. Yes, here we are, having this conversation, and just sort of the dead-eye nature of him. What did you think of David Tennant as Dennis Nielsen?
I mean, I think David Tennant is a fantastic actor. Anything I've ever seen him in, I don't think he's failed. He's great in Good Omens. He's been in Marvel TV shows, Jessica Jones. He's been in a lot of crime TV shows as well, including Broadchurch, which we've touched upon. When you see, recorded footage of interviews with Dennis Nielsen himself, it's literally like page for page. The mannerisms, the look, the hairstyle, his glasses, his skeletal demeanour is so on point that David Tennant, sometimes with actors, when they portray a certain type of character, you can't ever really see them other than themselves. For this, you almost at certain points you think that David Tennant is Dennis Nielsen. There's so many accuracies with his portrayal, and it can be quite frightening. I'd been reading that he had won an international Emmy for his role in Des, and he's had such a wide variety and quite a varied career. But David Tennant himself, he had kind of said that the opportunity to play Dennis Nielsen had been building for him for some time. He's always been fascinated, and as a young person, a young man, David Tennant actually lived very close to Cranley Gardens, so he knew as a kid and hearing it from his parents all about Dennis Nielsen. He had also read Killing for Company out of his own interest before actually being attached to playing the role. He had also actually been attached to a really dark film that was due to be created about Nielsen, which then fell through. So when he was approached for the role, he almost jumped at the chance. And he also had said, this is in an interview with The Guardian, that he always struggled with how the portrayal of Dennis Nielsen would come across. It's such a sensitive and very disturbing tale and issue that he wanted to find the right writer and right director. So as previously working with Lewis Arnold on, as I'd said, Broadchurch, he had also seen a script that the writer Luke Neal had written, and he appreciated the sensitivity and wanted to help them tell the tale, for the victims, and also tell it with accuracy as well. I think at this point, since we're talking about David Tennant's portrayal, it would be really good to hear a video clip of I don't want to say the real Dennis Nielsen, but of Dennis himself. I don't want to sort of put like a warning. He does talk about, in the clip, some of the ways that he disposed of the bodies. So some of you may find it quite disturbing. However, I would even maybe listen to the first 5 to 10 seconds. If you haven't actually seen the TV show, I would highly recommend, even seeing it here in a clip after, because the accuracies between his accent that David Tennant portrays and the real Dennis Nielsen is like for like. So this is a clip from an interview with Dennis Nielsen in prison.
I was 12, I wasn't 15 or 16. When I was at the back of the police car heading to the police station at the moment of my arrest, they asked me how many there were, and I didn't really know. I just gave them a figure. And because I was cooperating with the police, I decided I'll stick with it. There were three of those victims were invented just to complement the continuity of evidence to the police, because to keep them happy. In the end, it was when I was, say, 2 or 3 bodies under the floorboards began to accumulate that come the summer it got hot, and I knew it would be a smell problem.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, I'm going to have to deal with the smell problem. And I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? And I came to the conclusion it was the innards, the soft parts of the body, the organs and stuff like that.
And after listening to that clip again, it gives me absolute chills and makes me feel sick. But it just sort of, I suppose, portrays how on point David Tennant's, portrayal was of Dennis. In episode 1, I suppose we could close this and move on to episode 2. The main real focus, Joe, in episode 1 is the frenzy and maybe the dismay of this actually happening in their own hometown. David Mays, who plays the chief inspector, him and his team continue to interview Dennis, and he just starts to reveal more and more. But he also, you can say that there's an extremely manipulative side of him as well. You'd mentioned his dog, which his name was Bleep, and the reason he had called it Bleep was whenever he first got it, whenever he would leave the house, it would almost bleep like a sheep. Rather than bark like a normal dog. So he had a border collie cross, I believe, that was called Bleep. So it's strange including this, and I think it's also included in the book as well, but he talks so matter-of-factly and, as you mentioned, so stoically about his victims, but then he gets very distressed when he talks about his dog, particularly how the police are portraying his dog, and you can see him kind of crack toward the end of the episode. Isn't that right, Joe?
Yeah, that's right. When you read the book as well, it goes into a lot that he really loved animals, which is a bit strange. When you think about serial killers, one of their sort of traits to identify them is that they're supposed to be cruel to animals. They would torture animals and kill animals, whereas Dennis was the complete opposite. He always cared for animals. He cared for like birds. I think when he was in the army, he even had a turtle as well that he looked after. Eventually they used that as the excuse to kick him out of the army because he got into fights over. His roommates would say, oh, that's stinking up the place, get rid of it, and it would lead to scuffles, and then they tried to say, oh, that's the reasoning behind it. But there is a strong undercurrent that it's more to do with sexuality than anything, which is sort of partially tied to his crimes, but not completely, because that's the biggest misconception when it comes to Dennis's victims, and the fact that they were all young men or even younger than that, but they were actually boys. In some cases, the fact that people jumped to the gun straight away and went, oh, they were all gay, whereas in fact it was just people he met in the pub, invited back to his house for a few drinks, and then took advantage of them based on how inebriated they were. But I suppose then as we move into the sort of the interrogation end of things, you see the first episode ends with Brian Masters becoming interested in the case, and then eventually Dennis, after getting a copy of one of his books, says, oh, come on in, I want to speak to you. So he's the only person that is invited into sort of visiting
his fold, let's just say.
Yeah, for lack of a better word, yeah, exactly, fold. So from there they start talking about each other. So I suppose it's a good opportunity to sort of go into a bit of Dennis's background from that. So from the book, he was born in, I believe it was the 23rd of November 1945 in part of Scotland called Fraserburgh, which is not too far from Aberdeen. The place he grew up in was a fishing town, and they say that these kinds of towns are just linked with death because obviously they're a very dangerous occupation, especially back then, to be fishermen. Sometimes whole families would go out and they would be completely wiped out, just given the nature of storms and everything else that comes with the job. So he was born there of a local woman, but his father was Norwegian, I believe. He was a soldier that was stationed there during the war, but he didn't stick around very long and eventually left. But then his mother remarried later on and had several children. But when the thing, I could go on more and more about his background, but the thing that sort of was the big turning point in his life was the death of his grandfather. So when he had sort of great affinity for, according to the book, it's whenever his grandfather died, he was in the wake house with his mother, and his mother just said, oh, do you want to see your grandfather? Took him in and he saw the dead body, and then Dennis just was like, oh, he's just sleeping, there's nothing wrong with him. But it just had such a huge effect on him that it sort of shaped his weird sort of relationship with death, and then that sort of spiraled from there. But on compounded on top of that, I believe his family lineage, there was a series of mental health issues as well, and with such a large family he always felt isolated on his own because he felt he was being neglected, which wasn't entirely true, because even when you're reading the book Killing for Company, his mother did show care for him, but there was sort of it was like a distance care. It was like, I do love my son and all, but I know there's something wrong with him at the same time. So again, it goes back to the idea of, right, if you know there's something wrong with your child, you need to seek treatment for them. But at the same time, you have to realise the nature of the time as well, where people, when they see, you know, there's something wrong with their child, it's just like, oh, they'll grow out of it, rather than seeing it as a potential serious issue down the line. Whereas now, obviously, you know, there's so much more in terms of aid when it comes to mental health. It's still not great, by the way, but it's still a step up from back then. Things could have been different from him, but it's not an excuse for what he done. At the end of the day, it's just trying to add a bit of context to things. And I think that's sort of interesting when I was doing reading, and just touching back to our earlier point, when you have American dramas and stuff like that, and stuff that sensationalizes a lot more than UK based stuff, they don't really care about the why. They just want to get into the gritty details, which is why I sort of appreciate the show a bit more, because in the interrogations they don't go into the depth of his background as much as this. They just go, oh yeah, he was born here, this happened to him when he was younger, he was in the police force, he was in the army. Like, they touch upon it, but they do it in a very clever way, in that they feed enough information through that to make you go, okay, that sort of makes sense, and that sort of ties this to that point. So that was basically his background in a nutshell. But just going back to sort of the interrogation nature of the sort of second episode, what did you sort of think of it, Thérèse, and sort of how it sort of painted the picture of Dennis and what he'd done, and, you know, even more information about his victims and stuff like that, because I feel like we haven't really talked about them too much.
We wouldn't have enough time to go into every single individual victim, unfortunately, because while he claimed that he had murdered 16 people, he had actually only killed 12, but he assaulted and attempted to murder 7. So no one confirmed deaths would be 12, and he was only charged with a handful of those as well. But we can get to that when we talk about the third episode. But yeah, coming back to the interrogation, it's episode 2 sort of then starts to flesh out essentially what happened. Dennis kind of turns his character slightly. In the first episode, I wouldn't say that he's polite or, you know, very cooperative, but he seems calm, cool, collected. Whereas in episode 2, as things tend to just not go his way, you see the character break through. So you see that the manipulation that he has. You know, I do think he was a very lonely man, a very confused man, claims that he was comfortable with his sexuality. I don't particularly think he was. I think it was something that he struggled with his whole life. I think he maybe looked at, you know, while not all of his victims were gay, and as you mentioned, Joe, that's a huge misconception. I think, you know, for some of them he was maybe jealous at how they lived and their lifestyle, and how he wasn't able to do that himself. But I also think that he was very clever and manipulative, even in relation to the careers that he had. So, you know, you mentioned he was in the army, he worked in the police force for a short time, he worked as a security guard, and he also worked, his final job then was working in a job centre in Leeds, a civil servant job, you know, all within the government, all with connections and, you know, ideas and ways of working that only certain type of people would, I don't want to say thrive at, but you would have to be a certain type of person to work in those departments. So, you know, the type of person Dennis was as a manipulator, I think those were the perfect jobs. And it also was the perfect way for him to meet people, particularly when he worked in the job centre. You know, a lot of the men he met, 99 times out of 100, he met those men in the pubs. But also he worked in a job centre that would have taken on a lot of homeless people. As you mentioned at the beginning of episode 1, there is clips embedded from real TV reports. And it shows that, you know, people are coming to London thinking that it is the Las Vegas or the New York of the UK, and they're turning up and it's gritty and it's dirty. The unemployment rates are so high, drugs, HIV is an epidemic. You're not allowed to be gay. It's illegal to be gay at that time. There was a lot of harsh realities going on, and Des was able to sort of see that from afar. He was also a raging alcoholic. You know, when you hear further or other sort of interviews with him, he does put in a lot of blame down to drinking, but that, you know, tend to move into his MO. So a lot of this does come out in the interrogation. It also in the episode shows the relationships he had with the police, how he spoke to the police, how he gave the police information, and then, as you mentioned, his relationship with Bran Masters, which as we go through episode 2 and into 3, Bran himself at the beginning seems very fascinated, obsessed, and then when he meets him and sort of sees the type of person that he is, I think he almost regrets pandering to him almost, because, you know, there's certain things that they withhold from the police, you know, different sort of people that he attacks. One victim I do think we should mention would be Kenneth Ockenham. Ockenden.
That's probably the most famous of
most prolific. Again, I'm not saying that the rest of his victims shouldn't be named. We'll name the actual confirmed ones at the end of the episode. But
yeah,
Kenneth Ockenden at the time was a very high profile case. They mention it in the episode that the office that Peter J works in, his team spent nearly a year searching for this fella. He had connections with local politics, he had connections with US politics, and he was a Canadian who had come over here and had essentially gone missing. He was one of only 3 of Dennis's victims that were actually ever reported missing. The rest, just because they were sort of homeless people or people who had fallen on hard times and maybe had lost relationships with their family, no one really had reported them missing. So there was only 3, and Kenneth was the most prolific. And episode 2 kind of focuses on him because it shows that office, didn't really want to investigate it because they had spent so much time trying to find out what had happened to him, and they'd essentially failed because they'd had to close the case. You see there's a scene where Scotland Yard gets involved, and Peter J's superintendent, tries to shut down the whole operation because they've mentioned Kenneth Ockenden and because the high profile nature, which we then learn toward the end of episode 2 and the start of episode 3, that after a very thorough search of both Melrose Avenue and Cranley Gardens, they do come across DNA that matches Kenneth Ockenden, and they're able to close that case. I suppose we'll come into the end of episode 2 as we get closer to the trial itself and talk about, Joe, I suppose, the decision that the police made to only try and prosecute him for one murder, which was for Stephen Sinclair, even though he had admitted to multiple murders and the forensic offices had started to identify people. Do you want to get into that point from the episode then?
Yeah, because it just harkens back to at the very start when they arrest him, like the whole thing about the case itself is that Peter J. Superior tells him we have to do everything by the book, because it's very easy for us as from an outside perspective going, oh, well, he just said he's done it. That kind of evidence only goes so far because, obviously, through our love of true crime, you always get cases of false confessions and stuff like that, and then that can lead to the actual person being freed from whatever conviction against them. But yes, when it came to, for me, I think it was the whole Kenneth Ockenden thing that threw a spanner in the works as such, given how prolific a case his was from based on his background. So what happened, I think, was a case of they had just seen, okay, he's named a few people, we've got evidence of a few, as it were, so far. We'll leave it at that there, and we'll convict him based on that there, because surely that's enough just to get him a guilty verdict. Whereas, Peter J. the whole time said, no, I want to get him on all 15. But what happened is there's a lot of bureaucracy going on and background politics within the station going, no, you're burning through money and resources here. We can't afford this anymore. So we either take things as they are and we get him on this, or we just we can't go on anymore, essentially. So that's another aspect of the show that I liked and helped sort of keep it grounded a bit more, because when you watch these other sort of crime dramas, they don't really go into that much. They're just looking to know the juicy details about the murders and that. And that's nothing just to praise the show on anyway. It's not graphic in any way. Like, the most graphic it gets is that you see some of the bones in the first episode, but that's just like a flashing image, and you can't really make out much from that. Like, the thing that hits home is the fact when you see the bags and stuff like that there, you're just like, oh, this is, horrific. Like, the image your imagination creates is worse than anything they probably could have shown you. Like, if they had a sensationalized about, oh, look in the bag, look what it is. Like, I think there's a case where Peter J. goes up to a pot and one of the other detectives goes, I wouldn't do that. And that's enough. That's all you need to know. It doesn't say, oh, there's a head in there or anything. It's just, that's it. So in that manner, it's handled very well. But going back to then trying him in those charges, it leads to his eventual trial. But that's what I really liked about the end of the second episode, and what sort of, going back to the original point, kept me hooked and made me and my girlfriend go, oh, we need to know what happens, is at the trial, Dennis says, he pleads not guilty to every one of the murders he's been accused of.
Charges,
yes, thank you. Yes, he pleads not guilty to each and every charge. So then that's a sort of a great cliffhanger. So from a structural perspective of the show, that's a perfect way to end it, to lead into the third one. So the third part starts with the trial itself, and in a way, it's the most heightened sort of part of the show in terms of like drama. But then again, that's the nature of all court dramas. I know this is only just a section of it, but the way we know he is guilty of all these things, and the way we sort of know the outcome. But to be fair, watching it the first time, I didn't know the outcome, and I purposely didn't look at the outcome. It was a case of, are they actually going to get him? Because the thing about the trial is it all boiled down to is what is going to happen. Can we try him on this evidence, or is he going to get away by, for lack of a better sort of term, pleading insanity, saying he didn't have the mental faculties to actually commit these crimes, just due to, some sort of mental deficiency he may have had. That's the part that sort of really propelled the show towards its big finale. But what did you think about the third episode and the trial itself?
I would agree that it is probably the most dramatized of it all. And I suppose, and again, we're not trying to say this didn't happen, because he genuinely did plead not guilty. A lot of this was heavily televised, and there was a lot of public outcry, but it was more because he wasn't getting his own way. He had asked for, his dog that he only really ever showed any sort of affection to or sincerity, unfortunately was in such distress and was taken into a dog's home and actually died. The dog had to be put down just because it got so ill and being separated from Dennis. He's told that shortly before he's due to appear at his arraignment, which obviously would set him off. He also is seen talking to Brian Masters toward the end of episode 2, and Brian is sort of backtracking and actually writing the story because he feels that Dennis is getting a kick out of the profile and out of the celebrity of it all, which again I think was very true, because you see it in the TV show, but it's also well documented that when he was in prison he regularly asked for newspapers to be sent in anything that he was included in terms of a headline. Anytime he was referenced on TV, he would incessantly ask the security about that. I'd say he knew exactly what he was doing. Up to this point he had played that he didn't want representation, so he didn't want any lawyers involved. He actually considered representing himself, and it gets to a point where he's lost the control of the situation. It's the police and the courts that are taking over now, and he does something that he only sees fit, which is manipulation. So he decides to say, I know I've admitted to all of this. He also knows that they don't have complete concrete evidence for every single one of the murders that he's mentioned. A lot of the things that he's admitted to, he's only partial names. One of the people that he had murdered, he had only known as John the Guardsman. He didn't know his full name. There was a couple of Stevens. There was a guy from Belfast, and the only, again, defining factor that he had for this person was he had a Northern Irish accent. So he knows if he pleads guilty at the end, whoever represents him will try for the insanity defence. So in episode 3 we see the trial, again very similar to what's documented in the book Killing for Company, but it goes to show that he was analysed by a therapist, both by the defence and the prosecution, and both sides come out to say this man does not have diminished capabilities. He absolutely is aware of what he's been doing every single point. They can tell that he's an extremely strange man, that there's no doubt about that, but he was well aware of what he was doing. He talks about his crimes and his murders with such detail, description. I would say, coming back to the point of, you don't physically see any gore or any horror. One of the things he did was boil heads in large saucepans and things like that. You don't see any of that. The horror really does come down to the descriptions and how cold Dennis Nilsen was about it all. He talks about this in episode 3, not so much in court, but sort of offline with Brian Masters and with Peter J, that he was just lonely, and I think he's questioned as to why he would lie with the dead bodies of his victims. He was a necrophiliac. He would perform sexual acts on himself but also on the bodies, and he comes across with such justification as to why he did that, and he claimed that he was saving these people as well. And at the beginning I would say he was probably pickier with his victims, and then as time went on, the more depressive he got, the more of an alcoholic he got. He just kind of lost one of himself, was choosing anyone. At this point I think what's good to talk about, and I'll come back to you on it, is while we know he was confirmed to have killed 12 men and boys, he attempted to murder 7. 2 of those victims actually testified in court against him, and they were the names here.
I know one of them was it Graham Spur or Graham Spike?
So there was Harv's daughter, who was extremely affected by his escape from Nielsen, so much so that he had thought that the horrors that he had experienced were actually in his dreams and that they never happened. And the other was Paul Nobbs as well. Both men actually went to the police at the time and reported these crimes, and they were followed through by the police, but both times they went to interview Dennis Nilsen and he had just said that they had a lover's tiff. So not actually seeing the physical violence events or the murders take place, but hearing their depictions of what happened to them, probably one of the most horrifying parts. If you want to talk about that in terms of how they were portrayed after reading the book yourself, but also how they were portrayed in the TV show.
The thing about with the testimony that really gets to you is the first interview between Peter J and Carl Starter, where he just asks him about, what do you remember? And in talking to him, he unlocks these memories within him, and you can see the way his sort of demeanour, he sort of folds in on himself in a way, and the meek manner in which he speaks, it's just like he's just opening all these repressed memories, because he talks about the strangulation and the attempted drowning, and then how Dennis tried to just pass everything off. It's like, oh, don't worry about it, it's normal, it's fine. But the deep sort of trauma that put into him, you just see it all over the actor's face. And then when you get to the trial and he's actually being interrogated, you do get slight moments where the judge just says, oh, can you speak up, please? When Masters talks about it in the book, they were a lot more harsh on him because they knew he was gay. They just came down on him like a ton of bricks. Like, you almost think, when you read it, he was put on trial rather than Dennis. It was more of an interrogation and an actual line of question. And I know when it comes...
He was the one who committed a crime and not Dennis Nielsen, yeah.
Exactly. And I know defence lawyers, they have to ask questions to try and defend their client, but at the same time, in the book, they were jabs in a way. They weren't proper questions. And when you're actually reading it, you're like, well, hang on a second. How come the other lawyer isn't going, objection? It's almost like, oh, I don't care either that you're gay. I just let this go. All I care about is the fact that I can, use your testimony to prove that Dennis was guilty. But yeah, when it comes to that end of things with the victims, it comes back to what I was saying originally, that the conception of this thing was you were like a partner for this fella or a lover for the night, and they'd sort of backed away from it in a way and their view things, but that was in line with the views towards homosexual people back in the early 80s and late 70s.
Aside from the fact that back then people had such horrible and hard views on the queer community, it was also because these people were deemed as homeless and deemed as drug addicts. And Dennis Nielsen, who was a civil servant who worked for a job centre, if people are going to come forward, there was numerous reported accusations of assault that the police apparently seen through, but then whenever they met Dennis and realised, oh, you're an upstanding member of society, you work for a job centre, you have a job, you're not living on the street, they didn't take it as seriously. So I think there was like a two-pronged approach here. It was their opinion of queer people at the time, but also their opinion of those who were struggling in life and didn't have a job, and they're not going, why would we take you seriously over someone who has a full-time job and has his own flat?
But that's the thing, it was just the attitudes towards back then, and the show does portray it fairly well, but again, it tries to do as much as it can within its limited time on the show, but it does it well. Then sort of moving on to the verdict itself, again, I think this is handled really well in the show in terms of building the drama of this moment, because initially the initial verdict of the jury was split decision 6-6, so then they had to sort of suspend court for the day, let them deliberate for a bit further, and then deliver their verdict the next morning. And then the next day they came back with a 10-2 majority that Dennis was guilty in all counts, and I believe he got a life sentence for each of the people he killed. Am I right in saying that, Trace?
He did indeed, yes.
Yeah. And the way, that's sort of going back to David Tennant's performance as the guilty verdicts are read out. He does have a stoicism throughout the show, but you can just tell, I don't know what he does. I think it's just a look in his eye or something that you could just see the penny dropping for him. Is like, oh no, this last line of defense I had to go, I'll just plead insanity and I'll only get a few years, so I'll technically pay for my crimes, but at the same time I'll be out in about 15 years because of it. That sort of penny dropping, going, no, you're never leaving prison again, weighs down him. And what I liked as well is the following scene when Peter J visits him and he kind of goes, oh, well done, you won. It's like a game of football they've just played against each other, like they're two managers in a way. They just go, good game today, you deserve the win and all that there. And you're like, well, hang on, like it just goes back to sort of narcissism and how he doesn't really care, it's all about him. And then you get that in the last scene with him and Masters, and he's like, I didn't really like your book because you didn't really talk about me as much. And then Masters goes, my book is a warning about people like you. It's not about you. It's basically to serve as a warning against people like you. But what did you think about the overall ending of the show then?
I think the ending tied it up quite nicely. It still fed into, as you mentioned, the idea that Dennis himself really wanted a whole celebrity, which I think while the show closes at that point, and we probably don't have time to go into it now, So, if you're interested in continuing to read about this story, Dennis Nielsen doesn't give up when he's put in jail in terms of making himself known to the world. It's well documented. I think I'd have mentioned at the beginning that he had written that autobiography and he had tried to get it published on numerous occasions, which was blocked quite a bit. He nearly goes through a prison reform at some point. He, while in prison, starts transcribing Braille for young kids, starting off with, I think it's English literature and numeracy books for schools. He then starts to transcribe, the periodic table. And there was a law that tried to be passed in the early 2000s that was against those who had been handed down a life sentence. That if someone who had been given a life sentence, no matter how many times, if they had served a minimum of 30 years, was it a case that they were going to be now reformed? And Dennis Nielsen was used as part of that case study, which again was to his delight because that meant he was back in the spotlight again.
Yeah.
And the defence for that had to put forward that, he was out here changing the lives of young people, the young blind people, looking out for them and things like that. Thankfully, it wasn't crossed in Parliament and he lost his case, but he tried numerous times to get himself out there.
Yeah, but that's the weird thing about it as well, because he always said, I don't think I would have stopped it. I've killed 15 people, but it could have been 15,000. The compulsion in him would never leave him, essentially. So no matter, I do believe in the nature of prison should be for reform, but I don't think there was any reform in someone like Dennis Nielsen. Is so hard coded into who he is that he was always going to do that.
And I mean, as I suppose we come to a close, and as we mentioned at the top, this is a whistle-stop tour of everything that went on. If this is something that you're interested in, please do read up on the story, and particularly the lives of the victims as well. It's well known that the families of his victims continued to campaign against Dennis when he was in prison. A lot of them campaigned against the publication of the book, both Brian Master's book and his book as well. They were, I think he was up for parole a couple of times and then appeared at all parole hearings, but thankfully Dennis died on the 10th of May 2018. He was in his 70s, which, I mean, for a man to have done that in his age is quite some age. He died age 72 from an aortic aneurysm.
Yeah.
So it was well documented that as he spent more time in prison, that he refused a whole lot of medical attention and wouldn't see the doctor. But one day he collapsed and was taken into the nurses, and I think a lot of people then took it seriously that there was something actually wrong with him because he refused it before. His body was cremated in June 2018. Only 5 people turned up to his funeral. 3 of those were prison officers and an individual with whom Nielsen had corresponded with while in prison. No family members turned up at the service. So, he did sever a lot of ties with his family as time went on, and they severed ties with him.
Yeah.
The government, in line with the Ministry of Justice, actually paid toward the cost of his funeral, which I think is ridiculous.
I know. What was it, over £3,000 or something?
£3,000. And I think a lot of people at the time, again, had contested to say, well, he did work, he was a taxpayer, he paid toward the government and things like that. But in my mind, no one who committed those crimes should ever be helped by the government.
Hang on, put it this way. See if you were to kick the bucket tomorrow, are we getting our tax money back to give us our coffins?
Absolutely
I don't think so.
Not.
Exactly.
So right up until his dying day, I'm sure he would have loved himself to have known that he was in the papers and caused great destruction. But ultimately, the main point here isn't about Dennis. Yeah. I know we did say that we weren't able to actually go through each individual case, but just at the end, I don't know about you, Joe, but I think we should name the victims, the confirmed victims.
Oh yeah, please do.
Stephen Dean Holmes was the first person that he had murdered back on the 30th of December 1978. Stephen was only 14 and he was last seen on the way home from a rock concert. We had mentioned Kenneth James Ockenden, who was 23. He was murdered on the 3rd of December 1979 and was a Canadian student on the tour of the UK. In 1980, we had Martin Brandon Duffy, who was only 16. He was murdered on the 17th of May Neilson had picked him up as he was camping out at a London railway station. On the 20th of August in the same year, he murdered William David Sutherland, who was 26. He occasionally worked as a sex worker and he met in a pub near Piccadilly Circus. Unfortunately, for the remainder of 1980, there was 4 unidentified victims, spanning from September to December. It's not really known what age any of these men were. However, they were between the ages of 20 to 30. The bodies had been left in such disrepair that they were unable to identify them, and also a lot of these people and their families hadn't reported these people missing. In 1981, there was a further 3 unidentified bodies, one of which was the man from Belfast, which we had spoke about, and the only distinguishing factor that Dennis Neilson was able to give was the fact he was from Belfast. On the 18th of September 1981, he murdered Malcolm Stanley Barlow, who was 23. He was the final victim to be murdered at Melrose Avenue. He had been in and out of care homes and had been living on the street whenever Dennis had picked him up. In 1982, in March of that year, was John Peter Howlett, who was 23. This was the man who Dennis had referred to as John the Guardsman, and he was the first victim to be murdered at Cranley Gardens. It was documented that Neilson didn't actually like this man whenever he had taken him home and had only murdered him because he refused to go home. But nonetheless, it's absolutely no reason to murder anybody. In September 1982, he murdered Archibald Graham Allen, who was 27, and he was the father of 1. He had went out for the night. His partner he was one of the 3 who was flagged as missing. Neilson had made him food. He had made him an omelette. And again, it's well documented to say that Dennis had joked to say, I don't know if it was the fact that the eggs were off or the fact that I had strangled this man that killed him in the end. And then finally, the last victim in 1983 on the 26th of January was Stephen Neil Sinclair, who was aged 20. Sinclair was originally from Perth in Scotland and was a well-known heroin addict to the police and home service care around that area. He unfortunately was the first that Dennis Neilson had mentioned and was the body that was found in the drain. So those are a mixture of both the named victims and the unidentified. I don't think, we can't really end on a high on this one because the case itself is so despicable. The only real high I suppose we can report on, Joe, is the fact that Des is dead. But with anything, I would say this is a pretty tough episode. We'll always keep the victims in our minds and in our prayers, and like everything, it's always about getting the victims' names out there rather than the absolutely despicable murderer that overtakes it. As we had mentioned before, if you want to know more about this, there is the book Killing for Company by Brian Masters. I would avoid Dennis Neilson's autobiography. And then there's also the 3-part ITV show that stars David Tennant called Des, which you can access. So I think that's all from us, Joe, if you want to close.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely everything. Very well put at the very end there, Thérèse. So I suppose we're going to be moving to something a little less gruesome for the next one, but we're not going to say what that is. You're going to just have to tune in and find out. So just while we're at just going through a few things, if you want to find out more about our podcast and the other podcasts within the Banterflix banner, be sure to follow us on all our socials on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I think TikTok now. Yeah, Jim is trying to get us into TikToks as well. But as always, there's the main pod with Jim and Adam, which is released on a weekly basis, so keep an eye out for that there. And just keep an eye out on the website just for any updates on our upcoming festival, which is going to take place in October. But I think that's pretty much everything. So all that's left for me to say is thanks very much, Thérèse.
And thank you very much, Joe.
And that's us. So be sure to tune in next time. But until then, bye-bye.
Bye.
On our upcoming festival, which is going to take place in October. But I think that's pretty much everything. So all that's left for me to say is thanks very much, Thérèse.
And thank you very much, Joe.
And that's us. So be sure to tune in next time. But until then, bye-bye.
Bye.